terribly worried that I wouldn't actually get a chance to talk to her properly because of a set of events that happened. She got taken into hospital. She'd been in and out of hospital a lot, but in the last part of the journey, she got taken into hospital, and there wasn't enough. There were so many people in this particular ward that we couldn't get a room for her on her own, and I felt very awkward because it was so public that there was all these people around us, and I just wanted to talk to her personally and tell her everything I could before, I knew ultimately before I lost her. Then things went even worse because there was this, I think it's called Nora, went through this elderly people's ward, and again I was thinking I wouldn't have that opportunity to have time with her. And it's really difficult if you're sitting by somebody's bed and there's even with a curtain around you, there's people everywhere, and you're wanting to tell them the most intimate stuff. You're wanting to say thank you, and you're wanting to say you love them, and you can't because there's so much noise going on. But finally they put her in this little room. It's a little white room, and there was just one picture on the wall, and I was very grateful. I felt really good to be able to go into this room because I could talk to her. I could tell her how much I loved her. I could tell her everything. I could also tell her I was sorry if I'd ever upset her in any way. And actually we had a bit more time than I thought. The sad thing was she couldn't really speak back, but I knew she could hear me. I knew she could, and she made sound that I knew her patter so well that I knew that those sounds, what they were saying. And towards the end, I took in her biography. She had written her own autobiography, which was lovely actually, and it kind of is one of my problems. I'm always racing around and not giving enough time to things. I'd never really read all of her biography properly. I'd read some of it, but here we had time. Everything stood still, and I read to her childhood basically, and it was an idyllic childhood, beautiful childhood she had, and I can see why later on she struggled, because I think if you have a beginning like that where everything is almost perfect, and she was an only child, so she was very much the centre and focus of a lot of people's lives, that as you get older and realise that life isn't quite like that little pocket of time, it can be difficult. And it made me understand actually some of I suppose the problems that we'd had at times, because there's always problems and challenges, but you don't understand sometimes where they're coming from. So it was very useful for that as well. And then I regulated the time that I do like a little concert, because there was a lot of time suddenly, and she loved to hear me recite and to say poems. So I took in her favourite poems, and sort of like on the hour I would do like a little show and read her favourite poems. Finally, of course, on the day that she died, they sat her up, and she did manage to get a few words out, which was that she'd had enough, because she was in pain at the end. And I'm so glad that I was with her right through that. I was able to reassure her. It was quite dramatic at the end, I have to say, unlike my father, who just, I wasn't quite sure with my dad if he was dead or not, because he just sort of slipped through the other side. But like my father, when they both died, there was an incredible sense that something had left, which was extraordinary. I suppose it's what a lot of people have experienced, but I'd never, the only two people that I've been when they've actually died are my parents, And in both cases, that idea of the spirit leaving was profound. With my father, the spirit slipped away, and then I knew, there was that moment when I knew it wasn't my father anymore. I could see his body, but it wasn't actually him. With my mum, it was more almost violent in a strange way. There was like it's almost like a little crackle of lightning, and she gave up the ghost. You know, to use those kind of metaphors, she did give up the ghost. With my mother, in a strange way, I lost both my parents again, because I didn't mourn for my dad, who I was terribly close to, as I thought I might, because he morphed into my mother, really, because they were a unit. So when she died, it was like they both died as well. And then it was kind of getting to life without them both, and it was like a whole canopy had dropped away, and suddenly you're not the child. Even when you're in your middle age, you're not, you know, somehow you still feel a child when your parents are around. When they're not there, you're kind of on your own to an extent, or at least it's a different, you are the next generation, and I suppose it challenges all your thoughts of mortality as well. But it was very strange. They had been a deep part of my life, mainly I think because they'd adopted me later in life, and they'd completely focused on me. So the void, the loss, was enormous. It was an unusual relationship we had, and I was very aware of that we had something very, very different. And to a certain extent, I sought their approval on many things, including, which was core to my mother and my relationship, was the poetry reading, was the reciting, was the drama. She was deeply interested and encouraged me. And quite some time after her death, I was asked to read a lesson at church. And I must say I was quite nervous about it, because I would always go round to her and read the lesson. In her later years, it was something to kind of give her a role, really. But it was still a very nice thing to do. And I went to church, and I felt a little bit, and it wasn't my usual church either. It was kind of St. James, which is a new church for me. And when I got there, they do things differently. You have to go and sit up in the choir stalls, and I felt a little bit awkward about that, to be honest, but I did. I sat up there. Then it was time for me to read. I read the lesson, and if I'd have been at my mother's church and my father's church, I would have sat down by them, and my mum would have given me a little nudge, and she'd have said, "Jolly good," and I would have felt I'd done well. So when I finished reading the lesson at St. James, I sat down, and suddenly somebody gave me a nudge and said, "Jolly good." And it was a lady that I hadn't even really registered, an elderly lady who had said those words, and it was almost as if my mother had spoken through her. It was her same tone, it was her same phrase, and it was a lovely moment. I felt she was with me. And to be honest, as time's gone on, I do feel their presence very strongly in my life.